My next guest is Natalie Vardabasso. Natalie is an education consultant, speaker, and podcast host who has served as a high school and middle school teacher, instructional coach, and assessment lead in a K 12 context, where she led her community through assessment and grading transformation. Her mission is to reimagine education through a liberating praxis, and she is currently doing that as a full time consultant, host of the EduCrush podcast, and by founding a program called the Empowerment Ecosystem that helps the middle children of education step into their power as a visionary catalyst. She left the classroom 5 years ago, and she was an English and social studies teacher at the time. She also taught different electives, such as musical theater. Right now, she's working a lot with the coaching and assessment leadership and has also transitioned to outcomes based grading in Canada. She was in Calgary, Alberta, and it works a little bit as well with Solution Tree. Welcome to the
Mhm.
podcast.
Hi, Dana. Thanks for having me.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
This is a fascinating question and one that I loved reflecting on because story is one of my favorite things. But it's interesting the premise in the trenches because when I first heard it and heard the name of your podcast,
Mhm.
I assumed it was talking about just stories of teaching because most people refer to teaching as, being in the trenches, you're on the front lines. And when I was reflecting on my story, it really wasn't something that happened when I was in the classroom. I actually don't have a lot of negative memories of being in the classroom. I think it gets a bad rap of being this thankless job or you're just getting dumped on by apathetic students and out of touch administrators and belligerent parents. But I remember just getting so much positive feedback from kids and from parents and from leaders. So my moment in the trenches, if we take it metaphorically to mean feeling trapped and feeling hopeless and feeling like I was stuck, was actually when I left the classroom. And
Mhm.
it was those first couple of years that I moved into an instructional coaching role, because you go from getting all of this positive feedback and the year-end gifts and the "you're my favorite teacher ever" to
Mhm.
basically zero. It's like 100 to zero.
Mhm.
And on top of it, you're tasked with change and innovation, which are things that inherently make people uncomfortable. And you're in this role that I've deemed as like the middle child of education because it's a
Mhm.
newly formed role. Teachers are well established, administrators are well established. And so you're left in the middle where you're not teacher enough for the teachers and you're not leader enough for the leaders. And as a result, I felt like I became this person who was running on a hamster wheel, desperately trying to get validation from everybody and feeling completely lost. And one bleak moment, that was my I was in the pit of the trenches, like grenades were flying in, dirt was collapsing on me, it was right before a PD day.
Mhm.
And I was about to start this day and it was about assessment. So it's a topic that, is already a little emotionally charged and I'm getting in the headspace to get the day ready. And my supervisor pulled me aside and said, "I just want to let you know that there's been some complaints about your passion. So if you could just
Mm.
tone it down a little bit, that would be really appreciated, I think, for everybody." And I remember sitting there like red in the face, couldn't think of anything to say back, absolutely devastated because I felt like I had been killing myself to try to feel valuable. And
Mhm.
in that moment, it was like this rock bottom of, okay, I have to pull myself, if you will, out of these trenches because this isn't working and I'm not getting anywhere. And it was really the beginning of my journey to reimagine what leadership truly means. And I
Mhm.
went from this hamster wheel of trying to prove myself to every person to realizing that we needed to come together to build together and to co-create. And that's where I really set my sights on the assessment system because that was a bigger goal than I could achieve on my own. I couldn't go away and create the entire K-12 system. I needed others and we had to build it together. And it was that shift in energy from I need to prove myself to what can we do that I think was the moment when I stepped out of the trenches, if you will.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and a lot of I've interviewed other instructional coaches on the platform, but a lot of them have not talked about kind of that middle child role and how like you're kind of in that no man's land, right? And
Yeah.
just also like you said, getting a lot of recognition as a teacher in the classroom by your students, but kind of having
Mm.
that role where you're just kind of like your own island, I would say.
Yeah, totally isolated. It's interesting. Other coaches didn't bring it up because I've reflected a lot on the fact that I'm more honest about the story since I've left my school based role and I've left the system. Because when you're still in it, you're so worried about
Yeah.
not looking grateful because everyone looks at you like, oh, well, you got out of the classroom. So who are you to complain? What do you do all day
Mm,
anyways? And I
mm,
hear coaches that are still in it in that same way I was, being like, I am so grateful. It's such a great opportunity. And they have like black rings under their eyes and they clearly haven't been sleeping and they're like not taking breaks anymore. And you're
mm.
like, is it though? Like there's something in that role that I think is that teams to be interrogated.
Mhm, mhm. So, as I mentioned in the bio, you've stepped now into more of a role where you're leading change in a complex system.
Mhm.
So, you're working a lot with reimagining education. And right now, we're still kind of coming out of just what can we do to have a new perspective on education. I think there's still a lot of turnover. Um, in some
Mhm.
schools, there's hopelessness, so how
Mhm.
do we actually transform this and
Yeah.
really start making change and just not do the status quo?
Yeah. I think it starts at unpacking what is meant by complexity because
Mhm,
there's a thing people do, and I've deemed it marveling at complexity. And you've probably heard it, Dana. It goes like this. Oh, yeah, Natalie, we should totally change grading. You're absolutely right.
mhm.
But it's just so complex. And
Yeah.
people kind of all around the room, everyone nods and it kind of shuts the conversation down. And so I want to say, first and foremost, that complexity is not synonymous with impossible. And a lot of people treat those words as meaning that. But the
Yeah.
truth of the matter is, we've shifted from a complicated world and system to a complex one because of the emergence of the internet. We
Mhm,
have, and social media especially, we have information coming at us from all sides 24/7, a multitude of perspectives, and it's no
mhm,
different in our schools. And so complexity just means that the tools that worked in our past aren't as, they're not going to be as efficient today. They're not going to be as effective. And so in a complicated system, we could plan with a little bit of predictability and certainty that the next 3 to 5 years we're going to unroll exactly as we were hoping. And we might
mhm,
have to make some adjustments, but it was a pretty clear path. With complexity, we just have such diversity of perspectives and viewpoints and factors that all we can do is plan to take the next right step and
mhm,
then let the complex system give us feedback so we know where to go next. But that means that we have to get better at clarifying a really compelling vision that calls people into doing the work with us. And I think one of the greatest tools that we have at our disposal and that we forget about all the time in leadership work and also in schools is story, because
mhm,
it inherently activates the head, the heart. And then if we learn how to tell the right kinds of stories, the hands, because it can instruct people on what it is they need to do.
mhm, mhm. So, in terms of like story, how can we really start using like storytelling to kind of look at being a reliable means of assessment?
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, recognizing that it just is. I think for some people's story, there is a bias that we all have that it's something that's done in the elementary years. If students are telling and creating stories, it's something kind of
Mhm.
playful and frivolous, but we should get rid of it by the time we get to the real critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting because our brains are storytellers. Like we are inherently wired for story. It's how us as human beings make sense of the world. There's robust bodies of neuroscientific research that supports this. And yet in schools, we always go back to this like extractive model that actually makes
Mhm,
learning harder. So if we even just take like a really local example, so take writing, for instance, because I
mhm,
taught, writing at all levels. As soon as you get into the high school level, most people think writing needs to become this really clunky, critical process by which students have a thesis and then they got to cherry pick information and move it from
mhm,
here and put it into their essay and prove their point. And it's hard. And I think we make it unnecessarily more hard than it needs to be. So Thomas Newkirk, he's written prolifically on the topic of literacy. He wrote a book called Minds Made for Stories, where he looked at the neuroscientific research and says we have to
mhm,
rethink even just like critical writing through story if we actually want it to grab an audience, grab a reader, and more importantly, develop meaning for the person who's writing and not just make it this clunky robotic process of moving things from one pile to another. And so he cites two other folks who came up with the idea of this inquiry-based writing approach, whereby rather than just stating a thesis and then explaining why it's true, we actually have to create the need for a thesis and then write towards it. So instead of 5 paragraphs that most of us would probably know off the top of our head, you got your introduction, 3 body paragraphs, conclusion. Your first paragraph is describe something in the story or the text, whatever it may be, that brings up a question for you, that's got a problem in there that you can't quite figure out. Next section, it doesn't have to be 1 paragraph necessarily. What is the question? What are you wondering? And then the next section is like, what are possible answers? Then the next section is, what did you land on is what is the most probable answer? And then zoom out, what did this teach you about the rest of the text or about yourself or life? Story, right? That's what happens in story. There's a problem, the characters work through it, there's some conflict and tension, and then there's some kind of a theme or a resolution with a new understanding. So that's just one very like micro example, but then there's so many ways we could rethink a lot of how we gather evidence in school spaces of what students are learning, but also how they're learning that would lead to deeper meaning. And then also connection, because story breeds connection and community as well.
Yeah, and when I was teaching French, I used Storybird. I don't know if you've heard of it, this online platform. So the students choose a template. You can use it for creative writing and language arts as well. But they choose like the pictures. Sometimes they can make their own template, but they have like the pictures for the story already there, and then the students write the story to the pictures. So is that kind of the same type? Because you're talking about writing to the thesis. Okay.
Yeah, similar idea. I mean, you could imagine a teacher that pulls pictures from history, right? Like in a sequential order. And then rather than just teaching a lesson, students and teams co-create what is the story these pictures are telling us. Brilliant. What a great way to see if they're making sense of those graphics in a way that you would intend and what they're learning accurately about history. So much you could respond to in terms of feedback and next steps in their learning. But I think, unfortunately, story is something that a lot of teachers will get behind in terms of teaching. They'll say, I love story. I always use it to teach my lessons. But it's interesting that we don't often give students the opportunity to engage in story because we all like telling stories.
Yeah, and I think like you said, a lot of the time in English class, it's like, okay, we have this prompt about the literature we're reading, for example, and that's like we're teaching to the standard, so we have to just complete this prompt, but we're not giving the students the chance to actually use their creative writing, right? I think a lot of the kids don't get really a lot of creative writing exposure until they're in college. So I did try to incorporate that, in my French classes several years ago when I was still teaching French. But, I think it's, like important. It's not just something we want to do, for upper elementary and maybe at middle school, but really,
and as the standards evolve, an important point here is like I was talking with a teacher just last week when I was down in Iowa, and he was like, I hear you, but I have so much pressure to get them prepared for the standardized test, and it's in this very specific format. And it's like, I hear you. They definitely deserve to have some kind of rehearsal with that format. But I think we overdo it sometimes and we make it the be all and end all in courses where it's just about building their skills of communication. And you can communicate through a wide variety of mediums. And in fact, that might engage kids more and trick them into the skills of thinking like a writer, like revision, that they don't even know they're doing because now they're making a YouTube video, for example. And then they can start to like have feedback around how are you developing your skills, as a reviser. And then that is more likely to transfer when they go back into that writing task. If we just hammer them with the same tasks and the same prompts and the same dry standardized format all year, like no wonder they hate writing. Like, I'm over this. Like it's on us to think about what are the other means of evidence that we could gather, but continue to move the same learning forward.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. So talk to me a little bit about the empowerment ecosystem and the voice method of assessment. Explain what those are.
For sure. So the empowerment ecosystem actually it was an idea that had been percolating in the back of my mind for a while, probably right in my out of the trenches moment of being like, wow, this is a lot harder than I ever anticipated when I moved into this leadership position. And then when I left my school-based role last May, I really started reflecting on how can I help those people who I believe are the biggest catalysts for change because they're not bogged down in the administrivia that principals and teachers are. They have the instructional capacity. They see all of the system. and they really just don't have anyone supporting them because most people haven't been in a role like that. So they don't really know how to help them. So I was like, I want to help those people. So how I built the program was interviewing folks across North America that felt they aligned with that feeling and the hope of reimagining the education system through assessment and rethinking grading. Co-designed a program with them, ran a prototype, got feedback, iterated, and it's really just evolved from there. So I've kept letting people know it's a thing. People keep joining. We actually just hosted our first summit in Vancouver just a few weeks ago. So members of the program came, but then we also extended personal invites to a lot of folks in our networks, and they all came, and it was an incredible experience, completely grounded in story. And so that's what that is. And at the core of it is the voice method, which is really my own deep thinking of what have I read, what's worked, what are the moves that these people can make to reimagine education through assessment. And so voice is an acronym because, we love our acronyms in education, but it stands for vision, optimize, invite, cultivate, and expand. So at the vision stage, that's where, and we could do this at the classroom level or at the school level. So I'll try to give an example for both. But at the vision stage, we just have to really clarify what is it we want students to know and be able to do. And that seems like such an obvious step, but I would argue it's the most skipped step. People say, well, it's in the curriculum, but they don't really clarify, like, what is that? And I even tell people, make a profile of a learner, 5 to 6 clear overarching competencies that are going to stretch through every unit, every project that you do, and that students can start to gather evidence of as well. So that's vision. Optimize is if you're going to say you value creativity, for instance. A lot of people will say, I want them to be more creative. What does that actually mean? Like, unpack. What does it mean to develop creativity? How do I know if I'm a beginner? How do I know if I'm getting closer to proficiency? Like, we really do have to use some of our assessment literature or literacy and tools to make sense of what that means, and then share those tools with others so they can self-assess on their journey. Invite, I usually say, is invite rethinking. I don't think we talk about this part enough in the change leadership realm, which is how do we invite our colleagues to rethink? How do we invite students to rethink? Because to do things differently is going to require some attention to the resistance that will come up. And that's just a non-negotiable. And if we try to put our heads down and pretend it's not going to happen, we're going to get very frustrated when it does. And then C is how do we actually start to gather evidence of learning? So there's the very traditional ways we've done it, written, tests, quizzes, all of those like traditional school tasks. But how do we expand that to think about all the different ways that there could be evidence of learning, and then really get into the nuances of how do we give feedback that actually moves the learning forward? And how do we empower learners to give feedback to themselves and each other? And then finally is expand. So I actually had to evaluate when I first started creating this. And then I realized I was just adhering to the systems that I grew up in, because it really shouldn't end in an evaluation. And I know that's like the typical summative assessment paradigm most people have. But I said, what if we could end in story? What if at the end of a period of time, students have gathered evidence of learning, they've reflected, they've given themselves feedback, they've come to some understanding, they tell the story of learning. And they can do that in all kinds of ways. And that kind of creates a cycle whereby it calls other people into their journey, and it helps them to see where they're going to go next. And then they can start all over again. So that's how I've imagined the voice process works altogether.
And so you're working a lot with these districts that you're consulting with and helping them implement this process?
In part, I mean, the process really lives with the empowerment ecosystem and the coaching that I offer in there, which is more of an online community, online program. When I go on site, often it's a lot more driven by what they're currently working towards. I find a huge topic right now is grading. So whether they're calling it standards-based grading, or they're calling it equitable grading, or they're just calling it modernized grading, whatever it may be, a lot of people want to rethink grading. So I find I'll do a lot of workshops and speaking and then coaching around that topic, or it'll be like very niche assessment design work. So kind of living in that optimize phase, where I'll come in because they'll say, okay, we've implemented it, but how do we actually do standards-based grading? Like, what does that look like in action? And you're like, well, that's an assessment design conversation, because we have to design for deeper learning. So I'll usually get brought in for very like pieces of the full process. But then what I offer in the program, I almost think of it like a train the trainer model, wherein like you can do what I'm doing, but you have to understand how all these pieces fit together. And you've got to know the full vision of where you're leading people to, because we need that catalyst inside the system to keep this work moving forward. Otherwise, I'm going to be a consultant who comes in as just another flavor of the month, and
Mm-hmm.
then they're going to move on to something else the next year. And that's my ultimate hope, is I don't want that, which is why I wanted the program to exist too, is to
Mm-hmm.
keep those people on the inside pushing for longer term change.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, there's a lot of people that want to dip their toe into standards based or equitable grading. And like they have bits and pieces of knowledge because people have worked in some other systems, but like really to implement something, like you said, have something that guides them, have something with a consultant that follows up throughout the year with
Mm-hmm.
them or the year after and things like that. Really, yeah, like you said, be the change process as opposed to just having ideas that might last and then
Mm-hmm.
move on to something different when a
Mm-hmm.
new administrator starts like
That
that.
part.
That seems to be yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
you need to
I've seen that
actually
happen again and
sustain.
again and
Yeah,
again. That's like really the biggest problem, I think. If teacher turnover is a part of it
yeah.
too, for sure, but senior leadership, like superintendent turnover,
Hmm.
man, does that just pull the rug out of so many change efforts and lead to so much frustration for everyone in the system.
Hmm. Hmm. So you have mentioned that you are currently writing a book with Tom Schimmer.
Mhm.
There's currently not a title to the book, but talk to me a little bit about this and maybe when people can expect to see it out.
Yeah, well, let's say the working title is Rehumanizing Assessment Through Story.
Hmm.
So we're taking both of our wealths of knowledge around assessment and then saying, what if we looked at story as both a valid and reliable means of assessment of all
Hmm.
kinds of things? Not only what students are learning, so the standards, if you will, but
Hmm.
how they're learning. So how they're starting to figure out who they are as a learner, how they think of different strategies, their different self-regulation processes, if you will. And when it is coming out is a good question. Our manuscript is due in August, and then I've heard that the editing process can take up to a year. So still a little bit far away, but definitely going to be putting out content throughout the next year related to it, as people are
Hmm.
curious about this idea of how can we create the conditions for students to tell their story. And of course, we can think of that on a macro or a micro level. On a
Hmm.
macro level, like in my perfect voice vision, which I recognize is fully utopian, but you got to have a vision that moves us. They are telling the story of their learning. We are not
Hmm.
just handing that over to a transcript or a single grade.
Hmm.
They are the voice that is telling the story of their learning. So that's on a macro level. And then if we unpack that, there's a lot of things that would have to just in between to get them to the level to do that really well. And so
Hmm.
there's tons of opportunities for micro stories. Like
Hmm.
students can come in at the very beginning of a class and a teacher gets them to tell the story of their past experiences in that class. And then
Hmm.
they can use that information formatively by determining if they're going to change their design of their course based on experiences that have not been helpful for students in the past, or they could not. They could take that story and go, so that's assessment. That's all assessment is. It's evidence of learning. And so students have a story the second they walk in a room, and then they continue to develop that story as we create the conditions for them to do so. So it all connects for me, but the ultimate goal is how do we create the conditions for them to reflect on their learning throughout an entire year or a course and tell that story to an external audience.
Hmm. Yeah, so people can definitely look for that book. Are you able to share the publisher that it'll be published
Yeah, it's
through?
going to be with Solution Tree.
Okay. So definitely have that on the horizon, maybe for next summer.
Mhm.
And also, you are hosting a Grading from the Inside Out workshop in St. Louis in
Mhm.
December. So tell how people can join and register for that workshop and kind of a
Yeah.
little bit about the um, agenda.
Yeah, for sure. So I have to give credit where credit's due. Grading from the Inside Out is the title of a book written by my
Mhm.
co-author, Tom Schimmer. He's in the process of getting his visa renewed. And so we work very intimately. So I'm taking over this workshop for him, which is one that is offered to anyone to attend nationally. So if folks want to learn more, they can find it on the Solution Tree website. If they just
Mhm.
search Grading from the Inside Out, they'll see all of the offerings that are out there. And the topics that we're going to cover are really how to cultivate those mindset shifts on the inside of your school system before you jump to the external changes in grading, like the report card, which is what a lot of people want to jump to very quickly. So those 3 mindset shifts, which are things we can do absolutely immediately. We don't need to change a report card. We could still do them while we're in a system that is percentage based, that is task based, that results in a single letter grade, are giving students full credit for what they know. So fixing some of the mathematical inaccuracies that happen in percentage grading. and also really embracing this concept of reassessment and doing it in a way that's productive and not just an exercise of come again and guess differently on a different day. And then
Mhm.
the second thing we get into is redefining accountability. I find this is a topic high school teachers really like to dig into, which is basically if we're not going to give zeros on work, if we're going to just say insufficient evidence, and we're going to give students, longer to complete work if they need it, how can we ensure accountability? Because a lot of people will say, well, I need the traditional system, I need the zeros, I need the late penalties because it'll keep
Mhm.
them accountable. But that doesn't always work in practice. So we need to rethink those systems. And then the final piece is repurposing homework. So, how do we look at homework as a formative practice? And if we really want it to be that, then how do we need to interrogate including grades in homework? So, if we
Mhm.
don't grade it, how can we encourage them to take up that work? And how can we use that information to drive our instruction? So, how do we really get it back in the formative space? So, those are
Mhm.
the three biggest things. The other thing we tend to touch on is also assessing student attributes. So, all of
Mhm.
those behavioral attributes that are really important but shouldn't be included in the grade related to the standards because those are two different things. So, how do
Mhm.
we define them, unpack them, assess them, communicate them, all of that?
Okay. And would that have something to do when you're talking about the attributes with maybe
Mm,
a work habits grade? Because middle
yeah,
schools in the district my daughter goes to, it's not counted towards their GPA, but it's more of
yeah,
that like satisfactory versus unsatisfactory. They give 1 through 4s, but it does
yeah,
hold those middle scores accountable.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. There needs to be something, right, to communicate to both the kids and the parents that we do care about
Mhm.
these things. Like I've seen a lot of
Yeah.
schools do citizenship, like some degree of
Mhm.
citizenship as well. And then
Mhm.
the scale that we recommend is often a frequency scale. So
Mhm.
rarely, sometimes, uh, rarely, often, I can't remember the titles off the top of my head, but you know what I mean? A frequency scale from rarely to consistently. But it's a tricky one because it usually is, you can't really, it's not rubricable per se, but we do notice that the habits might increase or decrease depending on what's going on for a kid at the time. So at least it's a way into that conversation and to offer feedback.
Mhm. Mhm. So you also book work through schools and districts. So
Mhm.
how can people get in touch with you? And like you said earlier, often it is developing PD that's aligned towards their mission and vision.
Mhm.
So what would it look like if people were to book you for PD? Would that be like a several day thing? Do you do online workshops to follow up? How does that look?
Yeah, I do pretty much everything. A lot of my booking goes through Solution Tree right now.
Okay.
So if someone were to reach out to me, likely through Twitter, or they could email me directly, and I can give you all of that. So you can include it in the show notes, but it's at Natabasso on Twitter, and then just nvardabasso@gmail.com. So my first initial last name. But if they get in touch with me and they say, I'm interested in whatever it could be, I've been asked to do one-off keynotes,
Hmm.
to do a full day PD for all staff, to do leadership training, to do on-site coaching for teachers. So I'm actually like elbow to elbow designing with them, to do full year-long commitments or to just do a couple days, but it kind of depends on what folks are looking for. And
Hmm.
it typically is under the umbrella of assessment and grading is what I get brought in for.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, we've talked a lot about your trench story, moving
Mhm.
from that classroom to instructional coach position. A lot of what you envision now, some change in terms of empowerment, student voice,
Mhm.
and really how we can not make grading change so complex in schools, right? Because a lot
Yeah.
of the time we make those excuses and then just do the same old, same old. Out of
Yeah.
everything we talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
Big idea around assessment that I come back to again and again is we need to uphold it in our minds as a verb rather than a noun.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I'm sure everyone can imagine when I say noun, I think we all imagine this like pencil, paper packet, stapled, long, people at desks, silent, stressful. It's going to count in a
Mhm.
grade. And people put an S on the end. They'll say my assessments. And that's when I know they're still living in that noun paradigm.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I would just encourage everyone to expand your understanding of assessment to think of it more as a verb, meaning an interconnected process of actions that we undertake, like the voice method points out, that really inspire, motivate, and ultimately can reflect learning.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's so important to remember.
Mhm.
Not as something we have to do, but rather as something that we can expand as ways
Hmm.
of showing knowledge, like the creative writing.
Totally.
Well, you've already mentioned where people can get in touch with you. Like you said, you're on Twitter and Instagram, and people can also reach out to Solution Tree.
Mhm.
Is solutiontree.com correct?
Yeah, yeah, and you can even just Google me and find me on the website. But the best way is usually just to email or contact me, even through direct message on social media directly. And then I can connect you with someone who can help you out at Solution Trade just to bypass some of the red tape.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure speaking with you and learning more about grading.
Yeah, you as well, Dana. Thank you for having me.